All right, welcome back. So this is part two of Andean art, where we talk about the middle horizon to the late horizon cultures from the Wari to the Inca. And then at the tail end, we'll talk a little bit about what's happening in Colombia and also some new discoveries in the Amazon that could totally rewrite the history of South America as well. So just as a reminder, we're talking now about these middle horizon cultures. We've kind of cleared out the early horizon cultures, so the middle horizon cultures are these cultures right here, and it's roughly analogous with the classic period, the classic Maya. One of the things that set the middle horizon cultures apart is that they seem to be true empires. A little bit of terminology here. We often describe something as an empire, we just mean it as a big state, a powerful state. But technically an empire is a little bit more than that. It's more than just a powerful state, it's a state that exhibits administrative control over a wide region, lots of different ethnicities, and lots of different groups and kingdoms. So the Aztecs are often called an empire, but that's technically not an empire. They actually just kind of kick butt and take names and force people to pay tribute, and they don't exercise administrative control. But these empires, the Wari, the Tiwanaku, later Chimor, and also the Inca, genuinely do seem to control vast areas of territory, which means they're building roads, they're building complexes, they're regulating trade, those kind of things. I'm going to talk about the Wari and Tiwanaku, but let's start with Tiwanaku. Tiwanaku is a really amazing site that's known for these huge monolith and monolithic constructions. When it was first discovered, the archaeologist who discovered it thought that it dated to 15,000 BCE, and he thought it was the first civilization on the entire planet Earth. We now know that's not the case. It actually dates to the Middle Horizon, so 300 to about 1000 CE. But it's still an amazing place. You probably know about this site too if you ever watch the History Channel or Ancient Aliens or any of that, because it also comes up there because people always talk about, the precision of their monoliths. And yeah, they're really precise. They're pretty amazing. But these are certainly not aliens or done with advanced technology. Both, nearly all of the empires from this point on to the late Horizon period are going to be located in the high plateau. Tiwanaku is unique in that it's the only one that's centered in Bolivia. All of the others are centered in Peru, and they may have influence outside of that into what is modern-day Chile and Bolivia, but this one is centered in Bolivia, not far from Lake Titicaca. Stop giggling. And we're going to be taking a look at a couple of big sites, Puma Punku and Temple of Kalasaya. So this is where it's located, just to the south of Lake Titicaca. Here you can see how it's organized. This is the site from the air. And we have two major sites. One is going to be the Kalasaya temple complex, and the other one is Puma Punku. Here we kind of have a map. This map actually comes from the back of a ticket that you purchase when you go there, but it's the best map I could find, so there we go. So we have a large pyramid, the Akapana. Then we have the Kalasaya temple. That's where the Gate of the Sun and the Gate of the Moon are located, two of the most famous monuments. And then we also have this complex out at Puma Punku. Let's take a look at Puma Punku. Puma Punku is a massive, long complex with highly precise stones. Here you can see, this is basalt. Basalt is a very, very hard stone, and you can see how sharp the angles are. Remember, this is a culture that doesn't have steel. They do have copper alloys, but they don't generally use this for stonemasonry. They're using stone tools to achieve this. To do this, I know, despite everything you've heard, it doesn't take advanced technology to do this. It just takes a lot of simple tools, some ingenuity, and a lot of patience. And what you do is you polish these edges with a stone. Puma Punku has been a mystery for a long time because it was disassembled in antiquity. It was knocked down, probably by an earthquake, and it's unfortunately been turned into a quarry site. You have all these beautifully, sharply made stones with beautiful inset 90-degree angles. It's very hard to get a sharp 90-degree angle inside a stone like that, but you can do it. And they did. And they're really remarkable, but it was kind of like coming across a Lego set and having no idea what the actual thing looked like. So when I was in graduate school and when I was in college, this is all we got. This is all we could tell. No one actually had any idea what kind of building this looked like, because all we had were these disassembled pieces. This in archaeology is called a gok pile. Goks is G-O-K for God only knows, because God only knows where these things fit back together. We can marvel at the incredible precision of these cut stones, but there was no real way to know what the complex looked like. Until recently! And that we owe to the credit of Alexei Vranich from UC Berkeley. He put a team together that has given us the first plausible reconstruction of this site. And it turns out to be a series of pavilions all kind of linked along a causeway. And these pavilions are made of these massive monolithic blocks that are cut. What I think is so fascinating about this is how they figured this out. They went to the location and they scanned the measurements of every single block that was available. They then rendered those out into CAD so they could be manipulated in 3D, and then they used a 3D printer to print them up. And so you had little building blocks like this, little pieces that you could use. And then they got a group of graduate students, volunteers, together, and they just sat there and fit the pieces together until they found out how they kind of fit. So it was this wonderful example of experimental archaeology. Bomb, yeah, I know you hurt your foot a lot on the Legos spread across my floor, but I was actually doing experimental archaeology. Those skills eventually pay off. I think this is a really wonderful idea. It's a novel way to do it, that if you have really accurate printed miniature 3D models of the stones. I mean, you can imagine going to the site and trying to fit the stones together, how laborious and heavy that would be. But if you can scan them and make them into little blocks, and then set a team of graduate students who have lots of time, they can sit there and fit them together until they can find a way that they can fit. Now, part of this is still speculative. It's still conjectural, but it's done more for our understanding of this site than anything that's happened in a good long while. So what we see are, again, a set of pavilions made out of large blocks of stone that have inset niches. And the niches probably would have held representations of either ancestors or deities. These might have been offering sites. We're not entirely certain the purpose of Puma Punku. It means gate of the Puma, but those are names that are applied after the fact. We really don't know what they would have called it at the time. So if you go to the other side of the site, you have this pyramid complex, but by far the most interesting one is the Kalasasaya Temple. The Kalasasaya Temple is this, and it's named the Kalasasaya Temple because it has all of these standing stones. That's what Kalasasaya means in the native language. And you can see you have these massive sandstone blocks here, as other basalt and sandstone blocks are mixed together. And these blocks, you can see, are not very messed with. That was a terrible way to say that. They haven't been dressed down. They haven't been tooled to perfectly square shapes. They have some tooling, but for the most part, they have been left more or less as kind of natural monoliths, some of them sticking up quite a bit. Now, in this case, then the monoliths were then embedded into an ashlar masonry wall. What the heck is going on here? Our best guess of this is that the monoliths themselves are kind of a waka. They are sacred objects. Something about the scale or the shape of these rocks made them sacred, and they built them into the compound, filling the rock in between. And so you can see some of these monoliths are quite large. Either side of the stairway is a colossal monolith. Surrounding these monoliths are what we call tenon heads or protome heads. These are very, very similar to the kind of heads we saw at Chavan. So people suspect this would have been a place to make offerings. The heads here look more conspicuously human, unlike the heads at Chavan, which seem to be kind of human jaguar hybrids, these kind of shamanistic transformation. These seem to be more specifically human. Do they represent deities, ancestors, rulers? We're not entirely certain. But here you can see how the large monoliths are allowed to retain something of their natural shape and character, and that's obviously important to them. Something about these stones was significant. They are wakas in their own right, sacred objects in their own right, and so they are preserved by being built into the ashlar masonry wall. The courtyard is a sunken courtyard, so this is a tradition going all the way back to the Norte Chico culture that we saw earlier. Perhaps the most impressive feature of the site are these single monolithic gates. These are gates that are carved out of a single block of stone. So really incredibly impressive. This is the Gate of the Moon. Again, we don't know if this is actually a Gate of a Moon. That's just kind of a romantic name we've attached to it. And this one is the Gate of the Sun. Now, in its current location, it isn't quite in the same place that it was anciently. And in fact, there's a possible reconstruction of what this would have looked like, what the Gate of the Sun might have looked like at the top of this staircase and platform. For most of its history, it was broken into two pieces, and this is a photograph before it was restored. The location it's currently standing is a little bit off from where it was found, and that's always unfortunate. In the early days of archaeology, the tendency was to reconstruct these things just to make them look neat and shiny like they were in the past, but they didn't really take very good notes. They weren't very precise in how they put these things back together. So people have wondered if this thing had an astronomical alignment, and we don't know, because it's not quite the same place it was before. Ugh! Terrible, terrible. As far as the depiction, it is our staff god. It very obviously has an image of the staff god up top, and then it has 16 bird-headed figures, 32 human-headed figures, and 16 deity heads. So on either side of the staff god, you can see there are these bird-headed figures. Maybe they are performers wearing masks, or maybe they are deities carrying staffs. And they flank either side of the god who appears to be the staff god, maybe Viracocha. He holds a staff in each hand. You can see he has the radiating crown. He has the tears of the water coming down his face. He stands on what appears to be a kind of ushnu, a platform indicating his deity. And then underneath him we have these kind of floating heads. 16, 32, and 16 do not seem like arbitrary numbers, and every attempt has been made to connect this. Is this a calendar system? Is this numerologically significant? Is this something that indicates something about their belief system, how they counted the years, the days? We don't know. It's a shame that there's no writing or anything to give us any clue, a greater hint of what this may mean. I don't know anyone who doesn't think it's significant, who thinks that the numbers are an accident. It's not just a decoration. There's some significance here, but exactly what it is, we don't know. That brings us to the Wari. Oh, a word about spellings. I'm kind of inconsistent in these lectures. Generally, the modern spellings are they use the W for the hua sound, but of course, if these are written in Spanish, they're going to use the HU to produce that. And you'll see it spelled both ways, so hopefully that doesn't cause any confusion. I know I'm not entirely consistent when I do that in my lectures. The Wari are another one of these middle horizon empires. This one is located in the Andean highlands, and they share the same valley as modern Cusco. So one end of the valley was where the Inca set up their capital. On the other end of the valley was the ancient capital of the Huari. And they're especially known for their ceramics and textiles. Here we have this anthropomorphic jug that looks like a human head, beautiful polychromy. So this was the extent of the Wari Empire, and it exists towards the end of the Tiwanaku Empire and a little bit beyond, just further north. They were, again, a massive empire, and they built roads for the passage of porters. They had, defensible walls, and one of the things that really sets them apart is incredibly well-organized cities. This is Qorikancha. Qorikancha has this incredible grid plan. In the center is the administrative center, which has temples and shrines, but then we have this grid that goes out, and you can see how the city is divided up. You have these major thoroughfares that also have gates. We also have large basalt sculptures, and enormous gates and defenses. So a very, very sophisticated society, a very strong empire with massive defenses. The polychromed ceramics that they produce also are just really, really lovely. And here again is Viracocha, or our staff god. I love how you can see he has serpents coming out of his eyes, representing the tears. You know, the tears of Viracocha's eyes create the waters of the earth. And we have various other animals radiating from his sun-like crown, and he holds a staff in each hand. So by this point, this god is 3,000 years old. It's really kind of incredible amount of continuity. The Wari also have mummy bundles. They have large amounts of textiles. What I love about these mummy bundles is that the figure is in there, again, with its knees pulled up to his chest in a kind of seated, almost fetal position to indicate that it's alive, but the actual bundle itself is dressed as if it was a figure, indicating that in the mind of the people who created this, it is still accessible, it is still alive. And that brings us to the Sicán, which is one of the richest cultures out of all of the Andean cultures. So the Sicán are a middle horizon to late horizon culture, dating from about 750 CE to 900 CE, and then again they have a kind of break, and then they go to 1375 CE. And they appear to be the descendants of the Moche culture. In fact, they're right in the same valley. So the Lambayeque region, the Lambayeque Valley, where we have the Moche culture, this is the same group. This is also sometimes called the Lambayeque culture. Sicán is a name of a particular site, and there's some dispute over what we should call these. So the pyramids that we looked at before, we've looked at this slide before, and the pyramids in the background are pyramids from the Moche culture, and the pyramids in the foreground are from the Sicán culture. So they're literally right on top of each other in many ways. So we see a lot of different huacas and pyramid complexes gathered together, and these are just some of the richest pyramids that have ever been discovered. Inside these pyramids and platforms, there are a great number of burials, and much like the tomb of the Lord of Sicán, we find an unbelievable amount of gold and wealth in these things. Common artifacts are things like the tumi. These are, again, these half-moon ceremonial knives. The blades in this case, I love this. This one is actually made out of two different alloys here. So they have different colors. Handle made out of gold and decorated with turquoise. This one shows a seated figure who himself is holding a ceremonial knife and has this radiant crown. So really incredible, beautiful objects. We also see a large number of ceremonial masks, and they just have so much insane gold they can afford to paint it. Unbelievable. And so they would paint it red, paint it in cinnabar, which is this mineral made out of mercury that's very, very bright red. And again, that has this wonderful connotation associated with life and blood. Here you can see a mix of gold and silver and copper alloys. There are nose jewels often in these figures. These masks are ceremonial masks that are most often found in tombs and in votive deposits. And I wish I could tell you more about the context of these objects, but I can't. And the reason I can't is because almost all of these objects wound up on the private market. This part of the Lambayeque Valley was actually under the control of a single family for many, many years. And for the longest time, Peru had essentially no cultural resource management laws. Cultural resource management laws are the laws that prevent you from, say, digging up an Indian arrowhead in your backyard and just selling it. Anything that you find that is of antiquity, it belongs to the people, and therefore either has to be preserved or left alone. But for a long time, many of these pyramids were in private hands, and a few rich families, and one rich family in particular, and they treated it as their business. They went at it with bulldozers and steam shovels, and workers by the hundreds, and workers were given rewards if they uncovered the most gold. And so it's just tragedy, but they utterly and completely destroyed these pyramids, and an unbelievable amount of gold came out of them. And so if you see a lot of Peruvian gold and artifacts, particularly things like the Sicán vessel, those Sicán vessels were looted out of these pyramids, and we don't know their context. We don't know their provenance. The provenance is where this thing came from. That shows, who owned it. Anytime you have that much material goods going into the private art market and winding up into museums, it destroys information, and so much information has been lost because we don't know exactly. These cups sometimes were separated by hundreds of years, but if you take them all out of the ground, you lose all that contextual information. The other thing is that if you're producing stuff like this, it creates a market for frauds, that people know what they look like, but there's no context, but they're on the art market. It's very easy to put something out on the art market that's made out of the same material, and no one would be able to tell. So there are huge charges of forgeries and frauds of this material as well. One of the characteristics that we see is we see a lot of these beaker-shaped vessels, some of them decorated, again, with people who look like priests or gods or kings. It's always hard to tell the difference. One of the ones that's a typical style is the inverted vessel. Inverted vessels is such an interesting phenomenon because, again, it's a beaker. You can only fill it with liquid when it's right side up. But when it's right side up, the figure is upside down. Now, a lot of ink has been spilled on what on earth does this mean. The best guess on this is that these inverted vessels are a representation of some kind of underworld deity, that the deity is honored because he is in the underworld, and so when the cup is finished, you pour out your offering to him, or you drink your offering to him, and then when you turn the vessel over, you can see him right side up. It's a way of showing the direction of where the offering is going, that when the offering gets poured out of the cup, the god is right side up. So it's really kind of a clever design quirk that's unique to this time. And that brings us to the Chimú, or the Chimor. This is a middle to late horizon culture. And this culture is actually conquered by the Inca. They lasted right up into the 15th century and were eventually conquered and assimilated into Incan society. So they're very, very close to the Inca in terms of time period and also culture, but they're also one of the few places that gives us a sense of what the glories and the wonders of Incan civilization would have been like. Incan civilization was conquered by the conquistadors, and as such, a lot of their gold and silver artifacts were melted down or shipped overseas or lost. And so, ironically, this late horizon culture at the height of its civilization, we don't have a lot of material culture because it ends up being destroyed. But a lot of the stuff from Chanchan and Chimú end up being buried before the Spaniards come along. So it gives us a sense of what that's like. They too seem to be descendants of the Moche and seem to have conquered or assimilated the Sicán, although we do not have historical records on that. So they too are up here in this northern section just south of the Lambayeque Valley. Chanchan is an amazing complex. It's a series of compounds laid out in a grid in a massive city, all of which are made out of mud brick. The mud brick is used to create both massive defensive walls and kind of partition walls that you see here. It's really a sprawling complex. Each of these complexes seems to have a pyramid or a shrine, indicating that we're probably dealing with families, oligarchies, kind of sacred societies that are responsible for the maintenance of particular shrines. So you have nobles taking care of shrines. Remember, there isn't a distinction between, nobles and divinity. They are believed descended of the gods, and so that is where they get their right to rule. We have these restored but massive city walls with these two figures outside, and the walls are covered in a series of decoration. And the decoration likewise shows the influence of textiles. Here you have this geometric border. It's supposed to represent a river, and appropriately you have little fish kind of swimming through it. Likewise, we can see walls and decorations that have patterns that by that kind of wonderful pixelated style. Textiles are made up of little squares, just like 8-bit graphics, and so that's a clear indication that they are influenced by it. Here we see warriors carrying axes and maces with large headdresses, but we also have highly stylized figures based on textile decoration. We have a number of tombs and votive burials, and in those we have probably the most extensive collection of headdresses anywhere in the Latin American world. The Chimú headdresses are probably one of the most amazing finds. Here you can see these exquisite headdresses. Just to give you a sense of what we're looking at, these are what we would call ear gauges or ear spools. And you can see these are actually ear spools too, and this massive necklace is suspended from them. In terms of decoration, you can make out 2 monkeys on the head of this one, and this is the face of an owl right here. Here's a closer look at this one, these massive ear spools and the headdress. This one is made out of silver, and there's this elaborate nose jewel. There's an endless variety of these. I wish I had better pictures, but the wealth is just exquisite. Just look at this pectoral. A pectoral is kind of a ceremonial breastplate that just is there to show off your incredible bling. They don't get any less impressive when you look at them close up. Here we have, again, 2 ear spools, and the ear spools show a scene of what appears to be a god or a king. He himself holds a tumi, a ceremonial knife, and he is raised on a litter, and these 2 characters here are carrying him on the litter. In the Inca tradition, the Sapa Inca, the emperor of the Inca, was not allowed to touch the earth, and so it was a measure of his divinity. So we have the question, is this a representation of a king, or is this a representation of a deity? We don't know, but they must have something like the same purpose. This is a Chimú stirrup vessel entirely made of silver, and it has a series of enthroned figures. And this is probably a representation of an ushnu, a kind of ceremonial platform where the king would sit enthroned, or the king's representative would sit enthroned and give, kind of judgments in court. Has this kind of pyramidal shape. The other thing that we find a lot at Chanchan and elsewhere are massive amounts of textiles, beautiful textiles. The textiles are made out of llama and alpaca wool, so camelid fiber. In addition to these beautiful geometric ornaments, though, we also have a large number of feathered headdresses. Look at this feathered headdress. Oh my gosh, the neon colors. Some of the birds here are coming from as far away as the Amazon rain basin or Mesoamerica. So we've actually identified several of the species of birds here, which shows trade routes going thousands of miles. Many of the tunics actually show, again, stylized animals. Jaguars are powerful animals, but also representations of rulers. This is a necklace made almost entirely of spondylus beads. Spondylus is a kind of shell, and it's this bright kind of coral-colored shell that has to be crafted into these beads. Again, you see the influence of textiles. So looking at Chimú civilization, it really has this evidence of a really advanced civilization, gives us a sense of what the glories of the Inca Empire would have been like. Chimú civilization initially was thought to be much like the Inca and not to have much evidence of human sacrifice, but excavations at Chanchan have uncovered mass graves with large numbers of prepubescent boys and girls, sometimes as many as 80, being killed in a single go. So one of the universal characteristics of all New World civilizations is this preponderance of human sacrifice. But I always think we have to imagine this in the context of the times. We don't know as much about Andean and South American ideas about sacrifice, but we have to assume it's probably similar to Mesoamerican sacrifice in the sense that a lot of these were willing sacrificial victims. A lot of them were probably nobles because those are the highest people in society. That's the greatest sacrifice you can give. Some of them were undoubtedly, though, prisoners of war and tribute from other nations that were conquered. There's a mix of these. But again, the idea is that sacrifice is what keeps the world going. And that brings us finally to the Inca. For all their glory and all their amazing accomplishments, the Inca are just the tail end of a very long story. The same is very true of the Aztec. The Aztec and the Inca are both late civilizations that had only been going for about a couple hundred years before the conquest came along. So we have a late horizon culture that has a founding date of 1438 and doesn't quite even make it a century. Although there are elements of Incan civilization that continue until 1572. Once the conquistadors arrive, the Inca don't just roll over. Cusco gets conquered, but they have their fortress, their fortresses in the forest and the wilderness, and those hold on for quite a long time. You have the Vilcabamba Inca holding out for quite a long time. The Incan Empire, of course, we call it the Incan Empire, but Inca is actually the name of the ruler, the Sapa Inca, who is the emperor. The Sapa Inca is believed to have been a descendant of Inti, the sun god, and as such presides as the high priest for the cult of Inti. His sister is regarded as the high priestess of the moon god, and the two share those chief responsibilities. Interestingly enough, they have a matrilineal descent, which means that the next king is not the son of the current king. It has to come through the female line, which means it is his sister's son who is going to be the next king, or technically his nephew, who is destined to be the next king. Of course, if you're king, you don't necessarily want, your nephew to inherit your kingdom. You want your son to inherit your kingdom. And so they had a very simple way of getting around this problem. They just married their sisters, which was the traditional custom. They spoke Quechua, so the language of Quechua Indians in the high Andes was the language of them, and their administrative center was Cusco. They had a massive civil bureaucracy. They built extensive roads and a trading empire, incredible cyclopean works, etc. And it's also important to know that part of the reason they were conquered so easily is they had just come through a civil war. Let's talk a little bit about the Sapa Inca. So the Sapa Inca is genuinely regarded as being divine, a kind of god chieftain on earth, or divine king. The name of the Incan Empire is actually, and I'm going to butcher this, Tiwanaku, which means the four parts brought together. That is the four parts of the compass, the cardinal compass brought together. The symbol of the Incan Empire was a rainbow flag. And so you'll often see rainbow elements in their art and architecture. This is Inti Raymi, which is this kind of modern recreation of the Festival of the Sun that happens every year in and around Cusco. There's several reenactments that happen, and here you can see the person who's taking on the role of the Sapa Inca being carried around on a litter. He had a massive retinue of soldiers. In fact, there were 40 women that were to follow him around, and if a hair fell off his head, they were supposed to eat the hair to prevent it from falling to the earth. And it was in this state that Atahualpa first met Pizarro. So Atahualpa had recently fought a brief civil war with his brother Huascar, and he came to power. So the empire was already weakened when Pizarro showed up. In any regard, the Inca, quite frankly, should have cleaned the Spaniards' clock. They had far more weapons, and they understood that, if you stayed away from firearms, it didn't take too long for them to figure out firearms and to figure out how to stay away from them. And they really should have just, decimated the few hundred Spaniards that were opposed them. He literally could command 40,000 troops without a problem. But Pizarro was very cagey and figured out very quickly the weakness of the Inca, and that was the Sapa Inca himself, that he was the indispensable part of their civilization. And so he quickly took Atahualpa prisoner and demanded a ransom. And so it is Atahualpa that brings about the downfall of his own people, because with him in control of the Spaniards, They really couldn't risk his life, so important was he to Incan civilization. When we look at the Inca start as a relatively small nation in the Valley of Cusco, and then they expand very quickly over a massive territory from one end of South America to the other, from modern-day Colombia all the way down to what is modern-day Chile. And a series of roads were built, and those roads are still there. This is an incredibly difficult territory to get over, and so the Sapa Inca built switchbacks in roads. Those roads are surfaced with large blocks, so they're very durable, and in fact you can walk those roads today. The Inca also developed a system of messengers. A messenger of the Sapa Inca was not to be interfered with, and they developed what would be like a kind of pony express system. So if you remember the Old West, in the days before telegraph wires were strung across the American West, they used to get messages very quickly by means of the Pony Express. A rider would ride a pony for as long as they could get there. They'd ride horses, they'd stop at a fort, and they'd switch out horses and keep going. And they did the same thing, but they just did it with human runners. So one runner would carry the message, and he would get to the next, he would run as fast as he could to the next kind of way station. Then a new runner would take up the message and go from there. And by carrying the message this way, by one runner to the next, always having fresh runners, they could get a message from one end of the Inca Empire, all the way in Ecuador, all the way down to the tail end of Chile in about 2 weeks. That's really remarkable. Of course, they crossed a lot of these big, deep valleys in the Andes, and they built rope bridges to cross them out of grass fiber, of all things, but incredibly strong rope that they built. And this was also a defensive measure, because if anybody was trying to get to them, they could easily cut the rope bridges, and nobody could cross. They'd have to go down into the valley and up the other side. Cusco was the jewel and the center of this vast administrative complex that held control over and sway over a vast territory. This modern city of Cusco is laid out on the very same streets that the Inca laid out. And as you walk around Cusco, you can actually run into pieces of street and pavement and parts of old Incan buildings that existed. Cusco is over 10,000 feet, so it's very, very high up there in the altitude-wise, a little bit rarefied air, but because of that it has a relatively nice climate, but it gives you access from the Altiplano to all of the other territories. The city is laid out between two main roads, and you can see how this is structured. On one end of the city is the Qorikancha, and the Qorikancha was the palace of the Sapa Inca and also contained the temple to Inti, the principal god of the Inca. On the other end, we have the Sacsayhuaman. Sacsayhuaman was sometimes called the citadel, but it's actually more of a ceremonial center, a performance area with large terraces so that dancers could perform. The temple of the Qorikancha is still there, but it was built over with the Cathedral of Santo Domingo. So you can see the difference in the masonry right there. The gray masonry there with the incredibly well-fit, tightly fitted ashlar masonry. This is the Incan masonry, and the looser masonry is, of course, Spanish masonry. Incan masonry is just phenomenal. It's, again, on a level that is hardly ever seen anywhere else in the world. The joints are often what we call jonglered or juggled. That means that they have really interesting shapes. It's not pure ashlar masonry. Instead, you have these irregular interlocking shapes. And that makes a lot of sense, because this is an area that's very geologically active. There are earthquakes in the region. Many of the buildings built since the 16th century when the Spaniards arrived have collapsed because of those earthquakes, but the Inca stuff holds up. It was built for the ages, and of course that's why they built it that way. They built it deliberately to withstand that kind of stress. So you have these very large blocks, and they are interlocked. So very, very durable stuff. This is all dry masonry, by the way, not a single stitch of mortar anywhere in this. And people have endless questions about how do you fit something like this, and the answer is very carefully. You can lift these blocks. They did have the means to lift these blocks. And what you do is you take a block, you shape it to the rough shape that you need to fit it in with the other blocks, and as you get close, you rest the block up against the other blocks, and you have a thin layer of clay between them, and wherever the clay rubs off, that's the high parts that you know you need to polish down a little smoother. And so you take out a polish stone and just work at it, and you lather, rinse, and repeat until the fit is perfect. One of the things that people notice about Incan masonry is that it often has these little kind of nodules that stick out from the bottom of the stones. Sometimes they're chiseled off, sometimes they're not. We believe these were used to fasten ropes or to put scaffolding underneath them, to lift the rocks up, and then to lower them back into place. And you can imagine doing this several times before you got this absolute perfect custom fit. So when we look at the Qorikancha temple, this is the far corner of it, and large parts of the Qorikancha temple are still present underneath the church of Santa Dominga and the cloister attached to it. So the descriptions of this are absolutely just mind-boggling. Towards the far end is where we imagined the altar to be. And in this section up here, and you can see it recreated in this model, this is that existing wall that you can see there. And the entire upper register of stones was covered over in hammered gold. This was the main temple and shrine to Inti, and it was called the Solar Drum, and it was covered in gold. And here you can see the outside of it and the modern cathedral above, and this is what the interior was like. And it had a shrine to Inti as well as a kind of garden. Descriptions of it are just overwhelming. They said that there were llamas that were full size but made out of gold and silver. There were animals and agricultural products. There was actually a field of corn, and the corn cobs were made out of gold, and the stalks were made out of silver. There were whole trees made out of silver with birds in them made of gold, and the leaves were made out of gold. And some of these artifacts as votive objects survive, so we know that this was true. It must have just been absolutely staggering to the Spaniards. Here, in the lower parts of the construction are some of the preserved buildings. Again, you have these typically canted walls, beautifully fitted masonry, just incredible stuff. And then all of these niches along the outer walls. This may have been one of the fabled rooms that was completely covered over with hammered gold. Legend has it that also in this temple there were the 14 previous Sapa Inca. So Atahualpa was the current Sapa Inca, but all of the previous Sapa Incas, all the rulers before him, had been mummified in this sitting up position, and he would go into the temple to consult them as if they were still alive. When the temple was sacked by the Spaniards, the most sacred artifacts and the 14 mummies were taken away. The Inca fled with them, and they were never recovered. So somewhere out there, maybe there's some cave or something that has the other 14 mummies. Who knows? This isn't a terribly good reconstruction, but it gives you a sense of what this might have been like to have seen this entire thing covered with gold. People believe that this is the room where the gold ransom was displayed. So after Atahualpa was taken ransom, the first thing that the Inca wanted to do was to claim him and say, what do we have to do to get him back? And so one of Pizarro's men, just took a chalk mark and put a chalk mark up on the wall of one of these rooms in the Qorikancha, perhaps this very room, and he said, you have to fill this room with gold up to this line. So he just made a mark over his head as far as he could reach. And he almost did it in jest, with the assumption that, they couldn't possibly do it. and in a matter of 2 weeks they had filled the room with gold. They had stripped all the temples, everything they could, because so sacred was the Sapa Inca to them that they needed it. Well, this was exactly the wrong thing to do, because it demonstrated to the Spaniards that there really was an insane amount of gold to be had, and it just whetted their appetites for more carnage and more plunder. So let's take a look at some of the other monuments outside. Again, on the other end of the valley, we have what's commonly called a citadel, but it's not actually a citadel, it's another temple. And it has a series of these massive platforms. So here is the top of the citadel, and you can see we have another one of these circular sunken ceremonial centers. So we have a ceremonial center and a kind of pyramid at the top, but it is the terraces all around, these incredible terraces, that certainly could serve as a fortification, but probably more served as a kind of ceremonial center for dancing. And here the scale of the stones is just mind-boggling. You can see the scale. Many of these stones weigh in excess of 50 tons. And this is the location where today, when they have the Inti Raymi, the Festival of the Sun, this kind of rebirth of the sun, the legend of their mythology, here they are reperforming it out of the Sacsayhuaman. Right next to the Sacsayhuaman is the very famous Kenko stone. I wish I had a better picture of it, but this is the Kenko stone here. The Kenko stone, again, is surrounded by a platform designed for dancing and performance. The stone itself is a huaca, and it represents the presence of the deity and the presence of the god. Probably in this case Inti, and it may actually be an Intuit Tana, although that's not certain. So once the Inca were vanquished and Atahualpa died, the Inca fled to a number of their fortresses deep in their territory, and for many, many years, again, 1572, they managed to maintain their independence. The thing that ultimately conquered native peoples weren't the Spaniards and their guns and swords, it was smallpox. Just as in the Aztec sphere, smallpox ravaged the entire territory, and this sufficiently weakened their forces that they simply couldn't stand against the Spaniards. But one of the locations that they went to is now one of the most famous Incan sites, but it's only really been rediscovered since 1911, and that's Machu Picchu. So you have the Vilcabamba Inca. The Vilcabamba Inca are this Inca that retreat into the Peruvian rainforest section of the Incan Empire, and they managed to hold out till 1572. But there was this obscure reference in a Spanish chronicle to a city in the mountains that was practically in the clouds that had been taken by the Spaniards, but quite late. And Hiram Bingham was a archaeologist from Yale, and many people believe he was the inspiration to Indiana Jones. He said, what the heck? And so, working on extraordinarily thin evidence, he went looking for this lost city, and amazingly, he found it. This is what it looks like shortly after he cleared it. It's easy to see why it wasn't known for hundreds of years, because it's completely covered with vegetation. It was completely consumed by the forest. And so what you're seeing here is after they have removed most of the vegetation. Again, most people are used to seeing it looking something like this, but this is a modern restoration. This is after archaeologists have cleaned and excavated the site and cleared off all the trees and brush so that we can actually see the structures. So Machu Picchu is a remarkable location. For one, it's a completely self-contained city. It can only be reached by one of two routes. You can reach it from the valley below through a very steep set of switchbacks, or you can reach it from a saddle coming off the mountain. Both of those are very exposed areas and very easily to attack people who are trying to invade your location. So it's an extraordinarily defensible site. It also has a large number of terraces. The terraces, of course, allow them to grow corn and food, and so the entire area can be completely self-sufficient. There's a number of sites up in the higher part of the city, which again show us some of the details of Incan life. We're going to be looking at specifically what's known as the Temple of the Sun and the Intihuatana and some of the ritual fountains. So there is a natural outcropping of rock here, and a very large temple, what appears to be a temple built around it. Again, we don't know if this is actually a temple to the sun, but it makes sense, so why not? That temple itself is on a natural outcropping of rock. Remember, natural outcroppings of rocks, places where you have these confluences of stone and water, sea and sky, all these things are sacred to the Inca. So when you have several things that come together, that would make it particularly sacred. What makes this site particularly sacred is that you have this very prominent rock, this outcropping of rock, and immediately below this rock you have a cave. And in that cave there is a spring. So you have a spring, you have a cave, represents the underworld, and then you have a top, which represents sacred mountains. They must have loved it. All of these features come together, and so you can see how they have tooled and shaped this, but left the natural environment so that the natural spirituality of the site can be appreciated. Not far from there is the Intihuatana. The Intihuatana is the solar hitching post, or the hitching post of the sun. It acts as a kind of sundial in some ways, but it also represents the presence of the god. And here you can see, again, it is carved out of the natural existing granite. So the rest of the granite is carved away to create it. This is the only surviving Intihuatana. In the Spanish period, they were very nervous about Intihuatanas being worshipped as deities, and so the Spaniards knocked them all down. They broke them all off. This one, of course, because it had been abandoned, was preserved. Although it recently got damaged. They were filming a commercial there, and a piece of the filming crane fell over and chipped it. So now they won't be letting much go on there anymore. So while we have this mammoth, beautiful Cyclopean masonry that is one of these hallmarks of Incan civilization, we don't have a lot more than that. We actually have richer material culture from the Moche and the Sicán and from the Chimú period than we do from the Inca period. Again, they're the ones that get conquered, so all their material culture ends up getting, their gold and silver gets melted down. But we do have some textiles, and they really are just stupendous textiles. Really incredibly ornate patterns. Again, a combination of geometric patterns. And opinions are changing on these as well. For the longest time, people just assumed this was decorative patterns. But with the discovery of the quipu encoding more information than we ever could have guessed, now we're beginning to say there's got to be meaning here. And so I don't know that anybody is suggesting you could read this like a book and that there's a story to be told, but that certainly these patterns have some meaning, that they either represent crests or families or perhaps even kind of sacred societies. So we could look at each of these in the same way that we look at, maybe a tartan, in the sense that it identifies something. There's probably more information here than we could ever guess. These beautiful tunics are incredible. We also have a few ceramic objects. There is our staff god, once again. So we do have some Incan vessels. In this case, we can say it's Viracocha. We also have a few items in gold. Most of these we know from votive deposits or from intentional burials. This one, again, is a nose jewel where we have spiders. Spiders is a very common motif going all the way back to the Moche. We also have a few votive figurines in alloys of silver and gold. We have them both male and female, and these were typically dressed. This one has lost all of its clothing, but they would have been dressed up in elaborate feathered headdresses and holding knives, such as this one here. This one's been reconstructed, but it gives you a sense of what it was like, that they really believed that these votives embodied the presence of the god or the deity, and so were sacred. Many of these were left with mummies or sacrificial victims or in votive deposits, or were sent to the bottom of lakes. We also see llamas, and likewise llamas were sacred animals. Often these two were wrapped in fibers and other features to indicate their important status. So I have a couple of these that exist, but it's really kind of sad how little actually survives from the Incan period. Most of the gold and other stuff we find actually comes from the earlier periods because it was already in the ground, and as it got excavated, it got preserved, whereas the conquistadors were rapacious and just melted a lot of the greatest Inca treasures again down. So, I managed to get through this whole lecture without once referencing something from the Emperor's New Groove. I couldn't even work in "Yay, Malama" again in there. That's just pathetic. My dad humor is off. Okay, so let's move on to some of the other areas. Now, Colombia is an area I don't know terribly well at all, but I do feel like we ought to comment on the fact that there are other cultures outside of Andean civilization in South America. Most of them tend to not be very advanced civilizations, but we do have some beautiful, significant finds, and a lot of those come out of Colombia. So we have a variety of cultures, and many of them are just expert gold workers. These are Tirona gold pendant figures, come out of the Metropolitan Museum. Again, these probably represent chieftains or rulers. We have, again, geometric ornament, abstraction, very, very beautiful. One of the major groups is the Muisca. The Muisca are known for their gold. In fact, it's the Muisca that we get the story of El Dorado. El Dorado, I know people imagine El Dorado as this lost city of gold, but that's mostly myth. El Dorado actually refers to the chieftain, and it probably refers to a Muisca chieftain. The story goes that he would array himself in gold dust, he would go out onto a raft, onto a sacred lake, and then he would dive into the lake, washing off the gold, making himself as an offering, and the gold itself was an offering. And perhaps this raft shows that ritual, that we see the chieftain here, and he is surrounded by his entourage going out on the raft. This object itself was interred into a body of water. So many of these bodies of waters are, again, like huacas. They are sacred places that can be meant to receive gold. Here's a kumbaya figure, again, of Cacique. This is a chieftain. Here he stands holding symbols in each hand, and we see them, many varieties of this. About the only monolithic statues we have are going to come out of the San Agustin culture. These are also in Colombia, and they have these terrifying visages. We also find a few in what appear to be burials, tombs, that have large slabs created over the top of them. So here this one still preserves some of the paint. And likewise, here's another one. This is a tomb platform. So the deceased would have been put on the platform, and then you have these rather menacing monolithic figures as well. There are many other cultures that existed in this part of the world. Many were very, very sophisticated, and unfortunately, we don't know a great deal about them because they were lost. One of the more fascinating discussions is what may have been happening in the Amazon basin. So the Amazon basin is still one of the few areas today that has not been fully explored. It's a very difficult environment to work in. It's obviously very wet and it's very green, and so this means there's a lot of overgrowth that could possibly conceal ruins. It is also one of the few places that still have relatively uncontacted peoples. So this is one of these tribes that is out there in the Amazon rain basin looking kind of shocked at an airplane and shooting arrows at it. So between this and the North Sentinel Islands in the Indian Ocean, those are pretty much the only uncontacted peoples still left on the earth. For the longest time, we assumed that the Amazon rain basin was just this primordial rainforest, that it had been rainforest for as long as any human being could remember, and that other than these isolated tribes, there was no significant civilizations or cultures in there. And then some strange things started to be discovered. The Amazon rainforest has very poor soil. The soil tends to be sandy and clay, and that doesn't hold on to nutrients terribly well. That's why slash and burn architecture is so terrifying, because the reason they do slash and burn architecture is because they there's not enough nutrients in the soil to grow crops or to create graze for animals. So they cut down the trees and they burn them, and this is a quick way of getting nutrients into the soil. But honestly, if you cut all the rainforest down, you're going to have very poor thin soil, and you're going to have massive erosion. So it's a huge kind of ecological problem. But in various areas of the Amazon forest, sometimes deep in the Amazon forest, they would find this stuff, terra preta. And terra preta is, black earth. And it's an earth that has its own microbial climate that causes the organic matter to decay and naturally fertilizes the soil. For the longest time, this was thought to be a natural phenomenon, that this was something that just happened, every once in a while in a random patch of the Amazon rainforest. But then people started charting these pieces of black earth, and they discovered that they fall into perfect rectangles. And those rectangles are spaced from other perfect rectangles of terra preta, and that those are spaced evenly at 2 meters from the next rectangle. This is not a natural phenomenon. This is fertilized ground, and it was clearly made by human beings. Now we recognize that what they were doing is they were bringing fish and other animals up onto land to fertilize the land to create these rich soils and biomes that they could grow food on. So much terra preta has been discovered now that we suspect that maybe 155,000 square kilometers of it exist in the rainforest, and it's all over. That indicates that this was once not rainforest. This was once agricultural land that was being harvested. And then the geeks and the nerds on Google Earth started discovering these things. One of the good things to come from slash and burn agriculture in the region is that once they had cleared the forest, people could see these massive geoglyphs. Of course, with Google Earth and satellites constantly updating, more and more of these are turning up on databases of satellites, and kind of amateur archaeologists are finding them. And they are clearly man-made. Some of them are just enormous, hundreds of feet across. They have regular shapes, perfect 90-degree angles, perfect circles, and they are clearly not geological formations. They are man-made formations. They are earthworks. They are probably the bases of at least ceremonial centers and possibly cities. And literally hundreds of these are popping up everywhere the land is being cleared. We now suspect that most of what we call the Amazon rainforest was once cleared land, and that it supported a vast population of people. How many? No one can say for sure. It may be as as high as 80 million people living in that place. That seems a little high, but it's definitely in the realm of millions. And we have no idea who these people are. We don't know what happened to them. The best guess is that when the pandemics hit the New World, when Spaniards brought Western diseases to the New World, that these diseases moved through the trading networks. And so this is a case where the diseases reached these people before the Spaniards did, and they died out, and their civilizations collapsed, and millions of people died, and 50 or so years passed before any Spaniards got to the territory. Well, that may not seem like a lot. I mean, I live in Utah, and if you don't water your trees are going to be dead in 50 years. But I also lived in Pennsylvania. I grew up in Las Vegas, and I owned a property in Pennsylvania, and the first thing I had to do on that property was cut down 5 trees. And that was terrible for a kid from Las Vegas, because trees don't grow in Las Vegas unless you take really good care of them, and it costs a lot of water. But I quickly got over that because new saplings kept popping up all the time, and within a year they'd be as big around as your finger, and within a few years they'd be as big around as your wrist, and they were like weeds that you couldn't keep down. I remember there were, parts of the city of Western Philadelphia that had, the roofs of buildings had collapsed in, and trees had grown right up from it, and you had these forests. If there was a dirty bomb attack in Pennsylvania, a dirty a radiological attack and they had to abandon the city for 50 years, forget it. The city is gone. It would be completely reclaimed by the forest. It's amazing how aggressively and how fast the trees grew there. And that's not even anything compared to what the rainforest is. The rainforest regrows at an incredibly alarming rate. So if this civilization died out because of a pandemic, within a generation or two, all traces of their civilizations would have been consumed by the forest, and we never would have known. And so there are lost civilizations yet to discover. LiDAR technology can penetrate through the canopy and see some of these structures. They're using it to discover new places. They've actually discovered a whole city they call City of the Monkey God in Costa Rica. New sites, new Mayan sites are being discovered all the time. And undoubtedly, there is something there. If any of you are fans of the stories of Percy Fawcett and the Lost City of Z, they made a movie about it recently. It had Tom Holland in it, played the son in it, and Charlie Hunnam? I can't remember his name. This guy who played Percy Fawcett. Percy Fawcett was this explorer in early 1920s, 1930s, who went into the Amazon rainforest, disappeared, and claimed that he had evidence of a lost city. Well, maybe he was right. We don't know. And that's really one of the great tragedies of the contact is, it's one thing to be conquered, but at least the Inca, managed to preserve some of their culture. These people, whoever they were, just disappeared. Here's hoping that we may find some great discovery in the future. But whatever it is, it's not going to be aliens. I'm not going there. It's not aliens. Anyhow, well, that's the end of the lecture. Thanks so much. I really appreciate it, and we'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.